Hello and welcome to the 5th video in the Dot to Dot Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along video series. In this video, we're going to use the dot to dot technique to finish up that beautiful center star of our panel. Then we'll learn how to use dot to dot echoing to separate the center from the filler in the background. I'm going to demonstrate how to quilt it on a sewing machine and a long arm and give you practical tips on where to use these designs on your quilts. If you haven't purchased your dot to dot panel yet, it's not too late. You can still quilt along with me on this custom panel. To order or to learn more about all the exclusive products I put together for this challenge, click the link in the description box below or scan the QR code. So let's get to it. The center of our panel features diamond shapes that come together to make chevrons, which form the bigger star. This is the perfect area to try out some of those dot to dot designs that we've learned throughout this video series. But if you aren't sure how to go about doing that, or you want a little design inspiration, I'm going to show you two different options for quilting your center star. One that highlights the outer points, and one that draws attention to the center. Now, when it comes to machine quilting quilts on your sewing machine, the most difficult part for me and most other quilters is working in the center of the quilt. The fact of the matter is, when you're working the center, you have the whole bulkiness of the quilt everywhere. You're kind of fighting it. I like to call it the smush and push. But there are some things you can do to make it a little bit easier. First of all, make sure that you're high enough to your machine. You want to be able to push down and use gravity on your side to help you move that quilt throughout your machine. Now, I don't want to be so high that I can't see the needle, but I don't want to be so low that my hands are up here. So try to adjust your height to see if that helps out. A second thing you can do is make sure the whole quilt is the same level as your sewing machine. I don't want it hanging off the table or hanging down the side because I'll be fighting gravity on top of trying to move that quilt through the machine. So whether you have to wad it up, throw it over your shoulder, whatever you need to do, it will make it a lot easier. One thing that I find helpful are these quilt clips. They're nice and cheap, and I can use them to kind of roll up the quilt and keep it together and keep that bulk from hanging down. And lastly, just focus on the area that you're quilting. Instead of worrying about the whole quilt hanging down, just focus on that portion and know that eventually you'll be done and your quilt will look great. First, let's see how I use the diamond design to draw attention to the outer corners. I'm going to group these two blocks with the diamond design. I'm going to start from one corner, quilt to the bottom of that block, and then continue on to the opposite corner of the next block. Being able to reposition this quilt sandwich and move it around to make the design easier to quilt is definitely one of the benefits of machine quilting on a sewing machine. Now I have that first diamond design, and I'm going to add a couple more echo lines on the inside. Doing the same thing, quilting a diagonal line that goes from that corner, stopping about a ½ inch or inch or so inside the previously quilted line, and continuing on to the next corner. And depending on the size and the space available, I can add as many or as few of those lines as I want. This is what we talked about when we learned how to deal with irregular areas with the dot to dot designs. Simply using the quilting to create the shape we want and then adding those echo lines inside. And when I'm finished, I have the first part of my design. I have this unquilted area over here, which is totally fine. I could leave it alone, leave it just as it is, but I'm going to go ahead and add a different free motion filler design in that space. And because I love feathers, I treat this straight line as a spine and quilt those feathers so that they extend from that point. You could use a different filler design if you wanted to, like wishbones or swirls, but hey, what can I say? I love quilting feathers. So I'll travel along the edge to get to the bottom of my design and then begin quilting my feathers from that point. Now I'm quilting a more custom type of feather in which I quilt one petal that goes out, travels, and then comes back. So I'm actually quilting them in groups of 2, but you could go with a totally different style feather if you wanted to. And I'm just going to work my way from one side of the block to the other. And if you want to learn a little bit more about quilting with feathers, you can check out my Feathers Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along video series, which is on my website, quiltingismytherapy.com, or you can check out my YouTube channel. And since I'm dealing with this irregularly shaped area, some of my petals will be bigger and some will be narrower. It's totally fine. I just want to make sure I fill that area in as completely as possible. And when I get to the top of the block, I'm going to travel back to where I started and do the same thing on the other side, quilting those petals so that they extend from the straight line and fill in that space as completely as possible. And I'm using this fluorescent pink thread so you can really see what I'm doing, but if you're quilting this on your panel, go ahead and use a thread color that blends in with the color of the fabric that you're quilting it on. Using a thread color that blends in with your quilt top could be the beautiful texture of the quilting without showing off every little mistake. I just love how the lines of this design really pull your eye to the outer points of the star while combining that straight line with the curvy, soft look of the free motion filler. This is a really great option if you're quilting a star block where the center has a bulky seam, because it allows me to kind of avoid that with some of the lines of the quilting. Now in this example, I quilted the dot-to-dot design first and then came back in and added the feather filler. But just as we've seen in this whole video series, we can go about the designs a different way. If I wanted to, I could quilt the feather design while I'm quilting the dot-to-dot. The result is completely the same, just go about it a little differently. Let me show you what that looks like, and I'm going to demonstrate it on the long arm. I'll start the design the same way, quilting a line from one corner of the block to the opposite corner. From that point, I'll fill in the area between the line and the edge of the block with the feather design, just like we saw on the sewing machine. Working my way up the block to the opposite point. Then I'll travel along the edge of the block to get to the bottom and quilt a line to the opposite corner of the next block. Traveling back to the bottom and quilting the feather on the opposite side. And once that's done, I'll resume quilting the diamond design, echoing the lines I quilted. This is something I might do if I have a long arm with a smaller throat and I'm working on the side points of a star. Since I'm filling up the areas while I'm there, it can help prevent me from having to advance the quilt back and forth. But no matter how you go about quilting this design, it's going to look amazing. In the other two sections of my center star, I'm going to use the starburst design we learned in an earlier video to really draw your eye to the center of the block. Looking at these two diamonds, I'm going to pick this point as my home base, and I'm going to quilt my wedges so that they extend from there, echo the side, and come back. And like we've seen with all the dot-to-dot designs we've learned through this video series, I can quilt as many or as few wedges as I'd like. Like I said, this is a great option to draw attention to the center of the block, but also if my piecing isn't so great on those outer points, it'll help detract attention from there. Don't be afraid to reposition the quilt. Quilt this design in the direction that feels comfortable for you. Not only will you get better results, but you'll probably enjoy the quilting process a little bit more. And if your lines aren't perfectly straight, it's okay. We're aiming for straight-ish, not perfection. Like I said, I'm using a variation of the starburst design to quilt this section. If you haven't watched the earlier video where I show you how to quilt that, be sure to check it out. It will help this design make a little bit more sense. Of course, you can use a ruler to quilt these lines, or you can freehand them. One thing that will help you get those nice straight-ish lines without using a ruler is to be sure you look ahead of the needle. I know that can be super scary, but looking ahead of the needle will allow you to make adjustments as you go. Also, focus on just moving in a smooth line. Even if it doesn't go exactly where you want it to go, as long as it's smooth, it will look fine. I know that I tend to freehand my straight lines better when I'm moving in a vertical motion. So I'm gonna make sure I reposition my quilt so that that's what I'm doing. It might be different for you. Find what works for you and lean into it. And when I'm done, I have a beautiful geometric design that fills that irregularly shaped area while drawing your attention to the center of the block. It's just so neat to know that how you use your designs can help highlight your favorite parts of the block. Now let's see how to quilt those wedges on the long arm. Spoiler alert, it goes together the same way. The biggest difference to quilting this design on my long arm is I can't change the orientation of the quilt. So I'm gonna have to get comfortable using that ruler in all different directions. Instead of finding it daunting, look at it as an exercise to help you get comfortable using that ruler. And you've probably heard me say this a million times throughout this video series, but I like to quilt my center first and then quilt the sides, trying to keep it symmetrical as possible. And remember, when quilting those wedges, it's not the quilted lines that are going to show up so much as the unquilted area inside the wedges. So even if those lines aren't perfectly straight, I promise, when you step back, it's going to look great. So whether you use the designs to highlight the center of the block or the outer points, whether you combine it with a curvy design like feathers or not, using the dot-to-dot design in that center star is definitely going to make it look amazing. Well, once you're finished with that inner part of the center, we can then start looking towards the outer part of the center star. I'm going to use the same idea as I did in the center, using the starburst design in some of those points and using the diamond design in other parts of the star to draw attention to the outer corner. It's as simple as picking a home base and quilting your wedges so that they extend from that point, or using the diamond design to connect the points of our section. And then in the rest of the diamonds, I chose to go ahead and put a filler design such as the swirls, although you can quilt different designs in that area if you'd like. In this example, I'm going to quilt that starburst design so that the lines extend from this point and fill in those little blocks. Using the same type of design in multiple areas of your quilts not only give it a look of repetitiveness, but it also makes it easier to pick designs. This is especially helpful for sampler quilts or quilts with a lot of differently shaped blocks. And the great thing is there's no right or wrong answer on how to use these designs on your quilts. Play around with them, find what you like, and then use them in that way. And then in some of the diamonds, to change it up just a little bit, I'm going to quilt a filler such as a swirl design. Of course, if you want to keep going with the dot-to-dot designs, you can quilt a totally different design in this area, but every once in a while I like to switch it up with a different design just to keep it interesting. Now that we finished the center of our quilt panel, let's move to the background and see how we can use dot-to-dot echoing to echo outside of the blocks. Remember back in the very first video of this series where we learned the diamond design? We quilted lines that touched some of the corners of the block and stopped just inside other corners. We can use that same idea outside of our blocks to create a cool and interesting dot-to-dot effect by quilting lines that touch some of the corners of our blocks while stopping an inch or so outside of the other corners. Unlike traditional echoing, which has the same spacing throughout the design, dot-to-dot echoing could actually change the shape of the area outside of your block. So the points that you choose to touch and not touch can really create different effects. For instance, quilting that dot-to-dot echoing so that it touches the higher corners of my block but doesn't touch the lower corners can help take a pointy area and smooth it out a little bit. I like to do this with really extended pointy blocks because it can help smooth out the jagged area in between and make it easier to come back and fill in with a filler design. But if I want to extend the points of the block, I can quilt those lines so that it touches these points and then extends past these. Starting at one of those inner corners, quilting the line so that it's about an inch or so beyond the outer corner, and then going on to touch the next. Now, unlike quilting this design inside the block, the lines are going to get longer when used outside the block, so just be aware of that. And then once you're done with those echo lines, you can go ahead and start adding the filler design in the rest of the area. To really change things up, you can use both of these options. Quilt one row that touches some of the points and not the others, then come back and quilt a second row touching the opposite corners. Depending on what you're working on, you can quilt one option, you can add multiple echo lines, you can combine it with traditional echoing. There really is no wrong option. And if you want to include some dot-to-dot quilting in the background area, these light gray diamonds are the perfect opportunity to quilt some of your favorite dot-to-dot designs that we've learned throughout this video series. In those areas, I use the procrastination design that we learned earlier in the video series, but of course you can use another design we've learned or come up with your own variations for those areas. In the remaining background area of my panel, I'm going to take a little break from the straight lines of the dot-to-dot quilting and quilt an all-over design such as swirls. Not only does it add nice contrast to the geometric motifs of the dot-to-dot designs, it also allows me to change it up a bit and helps keep me engaged in the quilting. Now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on that custom panel I designed for the challenge, go ahead and fill in the rest of the areas with the designs of your choice. Whether you use dot-to-dot echoing to separate it from the filler, or change it up in the center to draw attention to different portions of the block. And as always, I've put together some free downloadable quilting diagrams and tip sheet that will help you with the concepts we've learned in this video series. This downloadable PDF is absolutely free. I just want to make sure that you're successful with the designs that we learned in this video. All I ask is that you give the video a thumbs up or subscribe to my YouTube channel. All you have to do to get those is to click the link in the description box below or scan the QR code. That just helps YouTube know that quilters like this video and helps others find it as well. And I'll be back next week with the last video in the series where we'll talk about quilting the optional borders for our panel. Until then, everyone, happy quilting.